My name's Craig Lounsborough, and I want to personally welcome you to this presentation of boundaries in ministry. Now, for those in ministry, boundaries can be difficult, whether it's our own sense of obligation as caregivers, or the roles that others have assigned us because of that position, or the expectations of the ministries or various organizations that we serve, or the traditions that we grew up in. The whole concept and implementation of boundaries in ministry can be difficult. And so we're going to come at boundaries from several different perspectives in order to both enhance and sharpen our understanding of boundaries, as well as their place in our lives and our ministries. Then we're going to get practical and discuss things like types of boundaries, the benefits of boundaries, the rigidity of various boundaries, why they're hard to apply, how to apply them, and signs that we may be lacking boundaries. Now, boundaries go all the way back to the very beginning. Creation begins with chaos. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, it reads, "The earth was formless and empty." And interestingly enough, God brings order out of the chaos by setting boundaries. So here's a few examples of the boundaries that God set in order to bring order out of chaos. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 4 through 5, it reads, "God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day." Now, the word separated is used here in the Hebrew means separating, disjoining, dividing, or distinguishing something that was previously mixed together. And so this particular boundary refers to something that was once mixed together, but now it's necessary that it become separate and distinctly different in the separating, light and darkness. And so chaos is brought to order by separating things and creating clear distinctions in the separating, in this case, light from dark. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 6 through 7, it reads, "And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it." Now in this verse, the same Hebrew word is used for separated. But interestingly enough, the essential nature of the element that's divided does not change. Water remains water, but the boundaries give water two separate roles and thereby maximize their efficiency. And that's brilliant. Genesis chapter 1, verse 8 reads, "And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let the dry ground appear." Now, boundaries create and maintain the diversity in creation. The boundaries create a place for water and dry land, which dramatically increases the productivity and diversity of life on earth. And boundaries preserve those differences so that the potential inherent in both is maximized. Now, what were the long-term results of the boundaries that God set at creation? Well, there's at least three. One, those boundaries created order. Number two, they created consistency of that order. And three, that created an environment to maximize growth. That is the result of effective boundaries. Now, boundaries for mankind. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, we read this. God says, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will certainly die." Now here God creates boundaries to keep mankind safe and to enrich mankind's existence. God creates boundaries that outline what is healthy for us and what is not. And those boundaries also include a warning as to what crossing those boundaries will result in. And the fact is, we live in a sinful, fallen world today because the first couple crossed the first boundary that God ever gave them. And we continue to do the same. And so, what are the consequences of violating God's boundaries? Well, the same is true today. 1, violation of the boundaries created disorder. 2, they resulted in inconsistency. And 3, violation of those boundaries created an environment that undermined growth. Now, here's several other biblical passages about boundaries. Then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. He, meaning Jesus, said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Now, what's really intriguing about this passage is that Jesus takes a break right in the middle of the demands that surround them. He doesn't wait for a pause. He doesn't wait for things to slow down. Rather, right in the middle of all of the incredible need that surrounds him and his disciples at that moment, he forcefully and intentionally steps aside. Now, we tend to wait for things to ease up. We wait for that break, which many times never comes. Jesus illustrated the fact that the degree of need around him did not offset or postpone the need for self-care. Boundaries keep the need for self-care central, so that the ability to effectively serve others remains strong and robust. The Apostle Paul said, "For each one of us should carry their own load." Look, one of the main abuses of boundaries occurs because people want someone else to do for them what they should be doing for themselves. Quite frequently, people have the expectation, particularly in ministry, that is our role in their lives. And we call that enabling. Enabling a person to offload their issues or responsibilities on someone else never helps that person. Clear boundaries force individuals to take responsibility for their behaviors or choices. And that creates the best opportunity for the healing that they need in their lives. The Apostle Paul again said, "Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character." Look, boundaries are also imperative in social groupings. It's not that we don't engage with certain people, it's how we engage them. I always tell my patients to consider your audience. In other words, the manner in which we engage people is based on who or what they are, not who or what we wish them to be, or who or what they've pretended to be, but who or what they actually are. And boundaries force us to define who or what people are, and then boundaries help us to construct limits that keep the relationship safe, constructive, and healthy. Proverbs 25:17 says, "Seldom set your foot in your neighbor's house. Too much of you, and they will hate you." Well, each of us can be too much of a good thing in anybody's life. Boundaries bring balance to a relationship by managing our interaction with others so that that interaction is neither too much nor too little. So let's look at boundaries in nature. True Nature wrote this: "The intelligence of the single-celled organism is not in the nucleus. It is in the cell wall. It is in the boundary. When organisms are keeping things out, they tend to contract. When they're letting things in, they tend to expand. Both are essential." You know, it's quite interesting that the nucleus of the cell doesn't control the cell. It's the cell wall. And the job of the cell wall is to keep things out or let things in whatever manner is necessary to maintain the optimal health of the cell itself. If the cell wall fails to maintain that balance, the life of the rest of the cell is in jeopardy. And here we see that boundaries are not just a convenience. Rather, they're critical to survival. The 2-minute tip said, across the animal kingdom, boundaries are tied to social order. The lower a baboon is in its group's hierarchy, the more often its boundaries will be crossed. Now, think about this. In the animal kingdom, it's not about the boundary. Rather, it's about the strength of the boundary. The boundary already exists. Boundaries are needed to maintain order and cohesiveness among various groupings of animals. But the strength of that boundary is determined by the position that the individual holds within the grouping. Therefore, the strength of a boundary is determined by the position that we hold in the situation where we're setting that boundary. And if our boundaries continue to get violated, it may well be that we're not holding the boundary firm, but it also might mean that we don't possess the power in that situation to maintain that boundary. As we're going to discuss in a moment, don't set a boundary that you don't have the power to maintain. True Nature said, go to where two ecosystems meet, and you will find the most diversity and abundance almost every time. Boundaries are always about where we can situate ourselves to thrive with others. Some of the richest and most abundant life on earth is found in the convergence of differing ecosystems. It's at this point of contact that both bring the unique elements of their particular system to bear in a sort of joining. But interestingly, neither is consumed or overwhelmed or destroyed in the joining. Now, a great example of that are deltas. Deltas are those places where freshwater and saltwater merge. The Mississippi Delta, the Nile Delta, the Amazon Delta, the Mekong Delta, to name a few. Now here there's a convergence where different bodies of water meet, but neither are consumed by the other in the meeting. And in this meeting, the richness of both ecosystems come together and merge to create an abundance and richness unparalleled anywhere on earth. Neither are sacrificed in the merging, but both are enriched. And I think that's a great picture of what effective boundaries can achieve in our lives and in our ministries. So, after having said all that, what's the definition of boundary? Cloud and Townsend wrote, a definition is a personal property line that delineates who is you and what is not you. Interestingly enough, as we will see in a moment, you cannot delineate yourself from someone else unless you know who you are. You may not know who they are, but you know enough about who you are to know who you are not. And too many people cannot define a boundary because they cannot define themselves in order to effectively define the boundary. Henry Cloud also wrote this, a boundary that shows me where I end and someone else begins, leading me to a sense of ownership. Now, if we know ourselves well enough to understand where we end and where someone else begins, then we also begin to understand what's ours and what's not ours. Knowing what's ours and what's not ours helps us understand what we're responsible for and what we're not responsible for. And without that understanding, we simply can't set effective boundaries. Boundaries are the lines and limits you create between yourself and other people. As we noted, understanding, 1, who we are, and 2, what we're responsible for, is essential in setting the lines and limits that make up our boundaries. Otherwise, the boundaries that we set will likely be more damaging than had we not set any boundaries at all. Effective boundaries are determined by understanding, one, who you are, and two, what you're responsible for. Now, this is the heart of why we set boundaries and why it's imperative to maintain them as we work to minister to our families and those in our various ministries. A boundary is a line of demarcation, now listen, that preserves and enhances my ability to be of maximum service to others. By preserving and enhancing my personal resources while refusing to enable or diminish another. So think about this. Boundaries keep us at our best, not for us, but for those that we serve. Boundaries allow us to effectively manage and therefore consistently maximize the resources that God has blessed us with so that we're able to consistently bring the fullness of those resources into the lives of those that we serve. Boundaries maximize ministry. The need. Learning to say no, because saying yes might be the easy choice, but it may be the damaging one. I think that those of us in the helping professions always want to say yes to the needs around us. And that desire often overrides the fact that there are times, and there are many of them, when no is the painful answer, but it is the right one. It might be the disappointing answer to people, but it may very well be the healthy one and the one that they need. Now, what do boundaries clarify? As Cloud Townsend said, what I am responsible for and what I am not. So again, one of the major boundary violations involves taking on what is not ours to take on. If it's not ours to take on, it's not ours because we're not the person to fix it. You can't own someone else's issues. Owning someone else's issues will never bring resolution to that person's issues. Now, lack of boundaries frequently arises out of an unwillingness to accept the reality of our limitations. To set boundaries is to accept those limitations, because it's only in the acceptance of our limitations that we can position ourselves to maximize those limitations in the service of others. Otherwise, we'll squander those resources trying to expand limits that we can't expand. So what boundaries respect and protect? They respect and protect the reality of my limitations. That I am only one person and there is only 24 hours in a day. And those are the limits. We're bound by those constrictions. In Psalm 119, verse 96, the psalmist says, I have seen a limit to everything. But your commands, meaning God's commands, are boundless. We are limited. And to acknowledge that is to honor how God designed us and to give Him maximum space to work within that design rather than spending our time fighting that design. What boundaries respect and protect? That I can partner with someone else in whatever the situation might be, but I cannot fix them. Let me make this perfectly clear. The only person that you can fix is you. And that's a massive task all by itself. You can provide support, prayer, encouragement, various resources, tools, companionship. You can provide all of that. But the individual must embrace those resources and bring them to bear in their own journey toward healing. And if they won't, healing won't happen. What boundaries respect and protect? Well, if we choose to ignore these realities, we are certain to head toward burnout. And burnout will diminish or altogether destroy our ability to be of effective service to others. Burnout is when, as I've said previously, we refuse to see boundaries as a line of demarcation that preserves and enhances our ability to be of maximum service to others by preserving and enhancing our personal resources while refusing to enable or diminish another. You ignore that reality, and burnout will come. So let's discuss 8 key reasons why we struggle setting boundaries. 1, because our sense of service or perceived obligation to others overrides a sense of what is best for us so that we can consistently be at our best for others. Look, our sense of service needs to be driven by our conviction to stay at our best so that those that we serve get nothing but our best. God doesn't give us his second best, and we shouldn't be giving that to others either. Number 2, why do we struggle with boundaries? The demands of others that arise out of their sense regarding the role that we are to play in their lives. Look, people will create a role for us that they assume we should fill. And often that role arises out of their own lack of boundaries. And because there's no boundaries that provide a guiding function to the creation of these roles, the roles that they create for us can become excessive, unhealthy, dysfunctional, and overly dependent. And in setting boundaries with these people, we are in fact confronting the role that they created, and we're reshaping that role into something healthier. And many people will resist that reshaping because they will typically demand more of the individual than they want to give. Number 3, our perceived sense of obligation to others. We might want to revisit our definition of obligation. Our personal backgrounds, the movements that we grew up in, the culture that has impacted us, our own family dynamics growing up, all of that can shape our sense of what obligation is and what that means. Now, clearly, we are obligated to others. The parable of the Good Samaritan outlines the nature of that obligation quite clearly. But have we defined obligation as some sort of duty that we are bound to regardless of the circumstance? Boundaries will demand that we reevaluate our definition of obligation, not to escape our obligation to others, but to make certain that what we're doing is truly helping them versus enabling them. 4, why we struggle with boundaries, our inherent need to be liked, affirmed, appreciated, and valued by those around us. If our service to others is somehow driven by our need to be validated and liked by those that we serve, we're going to set passive boundaries, or maybe we're not going to set any boundaries at all. We don't want to fall out of the good graces of the people that we want to like us. And if we're going to set passive boundaries to appease people, it would be wiser not to set boundaries at all. Why we struggle with boundaries. Number 5, the need to meet some spoken or unspoken expectation of the agencies, organizations, or people that we serve. Look, people and organizations will create expectations. And those expectations are often based on something that really doesn't reflect the core needs of the individual or the organization. But those expectations become entrenched. Therefore, setting appropriate boundaries that address the real needs of the individual or the organization can meet with opposition. Why we struggle with boundaries. Number 6, we have a sense that if we don't help them, no one will. This is often the panicked response of the person in crisis. Their fear creates this myopic sense that we're all they've got. And if we don't set the boundaries in these situations, we ourselves can get caught up in some sense that, in fact, we are all they've got. At that point, we're no longer able to effectively analyze the situation and determine exactly what resources the person needs and how to access those for them. Or, number 7, we simply don't want to disappoint. We're caregivers. Of course, we don't want to disappoint. But we might ask what disappointment is. One of the best ways that I can disappoint you is to give you what you don't need, because I'm too afraid to set the boundaries that will give you what you do need. Now we're going to take a look at 4 main reasons why others struggle with boundaries. Number 1, people don't get what they're seeking from us or what they feel we are obligated to give them. The roles and expectations that people place on us provide them something. And that something is often not the thing that they really need. So to set healthy boundaries means that we need to shift the boundaries to what they do need. And that can create resistance. Why others struggle with boundaries. Number 2, people are forced to step up and move toward a greater place of independence and self-actualization, which they may find uncomfortable. In setting a boundary, we're moving people away from a posture of dependency toward a degree of independence, and that may be uncomfortable. That kind of move will demand more of them. It will stretch them. It will require a greater commitment and expenditure of their energy. It will demand that they step up and step out. And for many, that's both uncomfortable and unwanted. Why others struggle with boundaries. Number 3, in setting boundaries, their expectations have been confronted with a demand that they reshape those expectations in a healthier way. At some level, most expectations have a strong self-serving component to them. As we've noted previously, whether consciously or unconsciously, these expectations have been created in a manner that the individual derives something from them. And if we shift those expectations by setting healthy boundaries around those individuals, the individual is likely to lose something that they don't want to lose, but probably should lose. Why others struggle with boundaries. Number 4, the previous pattern of interaction or behavior that they have become accustomed to has shifted and is likely demanding more of them. Homeostasis is fundamentally balance. And when you set a boundary, in doing that, you're throwing the system out of balance. In other words, you're introducing something different. And the first reaction to a system that's been thrown out of balance is to restore the old balance, even though the old balance is likely dysfunctional or not sufficiently functional. So in other words, things get thrown off. And that can create anxiety for a lot of people. Now let's talk about types of boundaries. Types of boundaries. Physical boundaries. These relate to personal space, touch, and physical intimacy. We all have that metaphorical bubble around us. And the degree of rigidity regarding that bubble is based on the nature of the relationships that intersect that bubble. Types of boundaries. Emotional boundaries. These involve protecting one's feelings, emotional needs, and responses to others. Emotional boundaries are those that protect our emotions, and much like the physical bubble that we put around ourselves physically, we have a similar bubble around our emotions. And again, those boundaries are typically dictated by the nature of the relationships that we're engaging. Mental boundaries. These concern thoughts, opinions, and beliefs. Mental boundaries keep us mentally safe and balanced in light of the demands that are consistently being made of us. They keep us mentally sound and stable, particularly in stressful or demanding situations. Spiritual boundaries. These relate to values, beliefs, and sense of purpose. These are boundaries that are informed by our belief system. It is our faith that dictates the nature and extent of these boundaries, as well as when, where, and in what way we exercise them. Now, we've talked about boundaries in general, so here are boundaries more specifically related to ministry. Lisa Whittle in Lifeway Research suggested 4 key boundaries that will allow the individual to consistently function at their best in the life of their particular ministry. Number 1, time. Knowing when and where to offer up your time. A leader who never makes time for people may need a humility check. A leader who always makes time for everyone may have a self-esteem issue. A balanced approach is wise, responsible, and possible. 2, activity. As believers in Jesus Christ, we should have standards for our lives. This means we have boundaries around places where we could go, but we won't, lest it compromise us. 3, relationships. Leaders must be aware of the pitfalls, the attractions in every sense, and the vulnerabilities in relationships so the right kind of boundaries can be set. 4. Speech. There's no room for a leader who is following God to be using expletives and condescending language as a means of pervasive speech. The Word of God is enough. Now, let's take a moment and outline some of the boundaries for married couples in ministries. Ministry can be incredibly demanding and persistently draining. Therefore, the marriage needs to be maintained and cultivated as a place of solace, refuge, and sanctuary. So here are 5 basic boundaries for marriage. 1. Guard your time together. Ministry talk can dominate your conversations if you're not careful. Set a time and place for these discussions. Ministry updates don't need to seep into every corner of your lives. 2. Develop friends outside of the ministry. Ministry can come to define our lives as individuals, as a married couple, and as a family. You are far more than your ministry. Therefore, develop several mutual connections outside the ministry context. 3. Develop mutual interests that are not ministry related. Find things that both of you enjoy that are not related to ministry. These can be the development of hobbies or various activities that are mutually enriching and that provide needed space from the demands of ministry. 4. Time management. Set a high priority on quality time together. Schedule regular date nights and intentional moments of connection. Protect these times against unnecessary intrusions. 5. Confidentiality. Keep the personal matters of your relationship between the two of you and separate from your ministry. Keep in mind that you're married to your spouse, not your ministry. Now, here are 5 fundamental boundaries that Jesus repeatedly set throughout the life of his ministry. Now, clearly, he set many other boundaries, but here are 5 key foundational boundaries that undergirded his ministry. 1, he made personal prayer time a priority. 2, he was honest and direct. 3, he always set priorities. 4, he pleased God, not people. And 5, he obeyed God. Let's talk about degree of rigidity, rigid boundaries. These kinds of boundaries are unyielding and absolute. Rigid boundaries are frequently an impulsive or reactive response to whatever's transpiring around us. They often represent our need to take immediate control when we feel threatened, rather than determining the actual nature of the threat and responding accordingly. However, some rigid boundaries, like those demanded by our faith, are certainly appropriate. So one kind of boundary is rigid boundaries. Porous boundaries. These kinds of boundaries are weak and easily breached. Porous boundaries are typically weak, they're ill-defined, and they represent some sort of half measure on our part. These types of boundaries are frequently broken, and because they are, we would be wise to remember that if we set a boundary in a given situation and we cannot maintain that boundary, our position in that situation is weakened. Permeable boundaries. These kinds of boundaries can be modified given the nature and dynamics of the situation. Permeable boundaries recognize that situations change and shift over time. These boundaries are firm, but they can be modified as the situation evolves. Now, let's talk about the importance of boundaries. First, self-protection. Boundaries help individuals protect their well-being physically, spiritually, relationally, and emotionally, as we indicated earlier. Boundaries provide a protective function because the world around us and the demands that press up themselves upon us most often don't do that. They don't protect us. The importance, healthy relationships. They foster healthy relationships by setting clear expectations and limits, preventing misunderstandings and resentment. Look, many relationships get into trouble because expectations were never discussed or negotiated. And by the time they are, it's usually because some conflict has suddenly brought these unspoken expectations to the forefront. And at that point, the issue is often damage control versus the enrichment of the relationship. The importance, personal growth. Boundaries help individuals become more aware of their own needs and limits, leading to greater self-esteem and independence. As we've noted previously, boundaries both define and declare who we are and who we're not. And that understanding directs, informs, and maximizes our opportunities for personal growth. And without that understanding, we're likely to drift and be ineffectual. The importance, reduced stress. Setting and maintaining healthy boundaries can reduce stress and anxiety by limiting exposure to negative or overstimulating situations. Stress is typically not related to a given situation itself. Rather, it's most often related to our mismanagement of the situation. Effective boundaries allow us to more effectively manage those situations and thereby reduce our stress. Overall health and well-being. Boundaries work to maintain and maximize the health of the individual in order to maximize the effectiveness of their ability to impact the world for the kingdom of God. This illustration on the screen highlights the 8 main areas where boundaries can work to keep us healthy. Our ability to be of maximum benefit to those that we serve rests in part on keeping these areas of our lives healthy and balanced. And you may wish to take some time and evaluate yourself in each of those areas and see where maybe you need to create some boundaries. The implementation of boundaries can easily move into control and manipulation. Betsy Reed in The Guardian wrote, "Boundaries have a moral authority that's easy to abuse. Therefore, we need to be frankly honest about how and why we're setting boundaries." She again wrote, "I am not anti-boundaries, but they are so rarely questioned because they have a seductive moral authority as the dominant metaphor for how human relationships should work. So as we noted, carefully evaluate your intentions when setting boundaries. As ministry leaders, we're naturally in a power position. Therefore, it's imperative that we be very careful regarding how we exercise that power when it comes to setting boundaries. I wrote this some time ago. To exercise the implementation of boundaries for self-serving agendas is to abuse both the boundaries and the individuals affected by those boundaries. If boundaries become abusive, they're no longer boundaries. Real freedom for most people is likely being freed of my attempts to control them. Again, in setting boundaries, we need to be clear regarding the rationale for setting them. If the rationale is not the benefit of all parties, the rationale needs to be reconsidered. Now here's 5 simple steps drawn from Boundaries for Dummies, which frankly is right up my alley. In applying these each time that you set a boundary, you will increase the certainty that the boundary is healthy, sufficiently balanced, and appropriate. 1. Pay attention to your strong negative emotions about a situation or another person's behavior. 2. Avoid jumping into action immediately when you think you need to set a boundary. Impulsive and reactive boundaries are unlikely to fit the situation and/or be enforceable. They're typically an attempt to exert control in order to calm a situation rather than understand the situation. 3. Consider what's in your circle of control when you're thinking about setting a boundary. Don't set a boundary that you do not have the power or authority to enforce. As we noted previously, if you set a boundary in a situation and you cannot maintain that boundary, you will undermine yourself and you will lose power in that situation. 4. Understand the difference between making a demand and creating an agreement. Agreeing on a particular boundary creates a sense of cooperation and collaboration. And creating that kind of culture will assist you in maximizing the benefits of the boundaries as well as ensuring their longevity. And 5, accept that boundaries, like everything else in life, don't always work perfectly. If you set a boundary, you're likely going to have to modify it at some point, as most situations are fluid in nature. Adjustments are a natural and needed part of boundary setting. As we discussed previously, permeable boundaries not only allow for this fluidity, they expect it. What are the consequences of ignoring boundaries? Pastoral burnout, much like professional burnout, is characterized by pastors experiencing emotional exhaustion, difficulty distinguishing themselves and their needs from their ministry role, and having a poor evaluation of themselves and their effectiveness. Again, the 3 areas of burnout experienced by the pastors are: 1, emotional exhaustion; 2, difficulty distinguishing themselves and their need from their ministry role; 3, having a poor evaluation of themselves and their effectiveness. In addition to these 3 general experiences, pastoral burnout often entails the internalization of negative feedback and ministry results, relationally withdrawing from authentic close relationships, and an overall question of spiritual calling or experience. Keep in mind that burnout entails these 3 things: internalization of negative feedback and ministry results, withdrawing from authentic close relationships, and overall questioning of spiritual calling or experience. Let's look at some potential consequences of a lack of personal and professional boundaries as suggested by the studies. Now, the 3rd line from the top on this graph, I want you to notice it. It reads, "I prioritize my self-care as a pastor." Only 15% of those surveyed strongly agreed with that statement. Setting boundaries is a major part of self-care. When boundaries are not set in the context of ministry, self-care will be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. So let's look at some other statistics as well. 80% believe pastoral ministry has negatively affected their families. 35% of pastors battle depression or fear inadequacy. 26% of pastors report being over-fatigued. 81% of pastors have been tempted to have inappropriate sexual thoughts or behavior with someone in the church but have resisted. 57% of pastors feel fulfilled, but they still possess a strong sense of discouragement, stress, and fatigue. Now, those are some statistics that we all need to take seriously. Don't think that they can't happen to you. As for both your personal life and ministry, I would suggest that you take a serious look at these 8 signs that you may lack boundaries. Sign 1. Decisions are made on the need to appease your audience rather than make the right choice. 2. The need for validation has left issues unresolved or has caused internal tension. 3. The fear of disappointing others becomes a major factor in decision making. 4. Your sense of whether you have succeeded or failed is based on the response of others, not the reality of the situation. 5. You tend to make decisions based on pre-existing expectations or standardized ways of doing things rather than the realities of the situation. 6. You take excessive amounts of responsibility for feelings or situations that are not yours. 7. You feel that relieving someone of stress or pressure is justification for sidestepping or somehow altering a situation. 8. You attempt to find the path of least resistance rather than deal with an issue directly. So how do you effectively, thoughtfully, and responsibly set boundaries? Here's 5 thoughts to help you do that. 1. Discretion is your friend. Let your guard down, but do it a little at a time. Protect the deep, intimate parts of who you are, both emotionally and spiritually. 2. Set boundaries before you need them. Put them in writing and have a friend hold you accountable to them. Post them somewhere in your office or classroom or at home. 3, guard your spiritual heart. Prayer is meant to be deeply intimate, bearing your heart and your emotions before God. Jesus prayed often and regularly in obedience to his will. It is the same for us. Prayer must be a central part of our lives as commanded by God. 4, maintain close connections with close friends and advisors. Keep interacting and participating in your existing relationships. These friends should be the main providers and shapers of your emotional life, your character, and who you are becoming. 5, recruit healthy collaborators. Bring them into your inner circle or onto your team, especially those with complementary gifts. Enlist them to help you with the needier ones you minister to. Now, Cloud & Townsend has some great materials regarding boundaries you may find valuable. They have a series of books on boundaries. I would suggest you take a look at those. Cloud & Townsend also have a great book on boundaries for leaders that specifically addresses leadership and the implementation of boundaries in a leadership capacity. Now, I have not read this particular book. However, I have included it here due to the fact that I have had several patients who have read it and found it very helpful in their lives. Kevin Thompson appeared on Focus on the Family and had some very solid and insightful things to say regarding boundaries. You may likewise find this resource of value. And then finally, Bill Gaultier had some helpful insights that will flesh out your understanding of boundaries as well. As we noted at the beginning of our time today, feel free to download this material and use it in whatever manner might enhance your life or your ministry. It's been a real privilege to be able to share with you this morning. I want to thank you for your time.